Cam. If it was a different forum, I'd love to tell everyone how I almost lost that single man status a week ago, but I'm on camera, so I won't go there. All right. So obviously, yeah, Luke Mancini. My study topics changed a bit throughout, so I'll explain that as we go along. But understanding the Australian wine industry, 2016 scholar, and fortunate enough to be part of the India GFP. So just to start off with, maybe not. This pointer's working, Liz, where is she? No, okay. Anyway, I'd like to thank Wine Australia first and foremost because they've funded this Nuffield Scholarship for me. The two contacts we had there, Anne Duncan, who's actually no longer there, and Liz Waters, who's no longer doing it. And I just make special mention to Keith Hayes, who's in the crowd now from Wine Australia. My mentor, who was an ex-Nuffield scholar, Liz Riley, she was quite formative early on when we're trying to shape which topic to hone down onto. And obviously my family, as everyone would probably thank here, specifically Mum and Dad, who backed me in a lot of harebrained ideas, and this Nuffield venture was part of one of those. And also my younger brother Xavier, who's shaping up to be a pretty good business partner, and also someone who manned the fort while I was sojourning overseas on this Nuffield thing. As it says, third generation farmer from Whitton, which is basically near Griffith. We cover a lot of territory. My grandfather came out in the late 50s from Italy, and we settled in Griffith as a family, I guess, in the mid-60s. As Cameron mentioned, my background prior to farming was a 7-8 year career within grain trading, and it was a fantastic learning curve for many reasons. The first and foremost being an exposure to agriculture beyond the farm gate, a very corporate, a very cutthroat world. And I was lucky enough to be part of a small team that I had a job everywhere from licking stamps and fetching coffees to going overseas to sit across the table to do a deal. So we have a diverse mix of crops, predominantly wine grapes, cotton, and winter cereals across six separate properties, which are all pretty much adjoining. We also have 20 hectares of olives, which that's my dad's little baby that he looks after, and we only really get into that during harvest. So this year we're in a bit of a transition at home at the moment, moving more into keeping our solid base of grapes, which have traditionally been our main breadwinner, income earner, and then moving into getting back to what Dad was, known for back in the day, for doing a lot of row crop, a lot of seed crops, whether it be sunflower, sorghum, corn, and now that's because cotton's taken off in our area. It just seems like a natural fit that we get back to our row crop roots. And being from the MIA, Murrumbidgee irrigation area, it's all irrigated agriculture, and it's a mixture of groundwater, so bore water, and then surface water coming off through the Murrumbidgee irrigation system, general and high security. So I think that's just me standing in a vineyard. That Block 2 Shiraz, that's, I think, probably once you've seen one vineyard, you've seen them all. Everything's done mechanically, so anything that we can do with a machine, we do. So that's mechanical harvesting, quite industrial, I guess. This is Dad in his olive grove, quite proud. We've got our own olive oil label that he looks after as well, called the Little General. And it's not named after me, it's named after him, just to be clear. And my younger brother Xavier, just overseeing the harvest, and a small picture of Dad in our first cotton crop. So yeah. Okay, so the wine tour, I guess, sorry, this IT thing's not really agreeing with me. The wine tour, okay. So I think probably sounds, well, it actually was pretty good, I have to be honest, but it wasn't all about going overseas and sipping wine and talking to sommeliers and trying to work out after the 5th bottle which one was the best. It was more about trying to drill down from everything, from ground up to, from a farmer's perspective all the way to I guess a consumer's perspective. And my topic was an attempt to, grasp the different roles of participants within the industry, and I guess it's a big one to try and tackle, but basically, 4 different, within the supply chain, 4 different key areas, being the primary production through the farmer, then onto the winery, then distributor, and then consumer. And in that, you've got, the different wine merchants, marketers, and things like that. Although I visited quite a few countries, I felt that these particular regions that you can see up there probably gave the best examples at not extreme levels, but just a little bit different, and to highlight those types of participants the best. France, I guess, is the obvious one, because as soon as one thinks of wine, I guess they think of France. So that made sense to go there, because it is a the epicenter of it, and Bordeaux in particular. And then on to Spain for an exposure to alternative varieties, and that was more from a marketer's perspective within the chain. California, because of the real life examples of sustainable farming, and I guess an exposure to an environment where they do a lot of bulk and they do a lot of niche wine supplies. In the UK, because of a distribution model that's probably most similar to what we have here in Australia, because it's dominated by supermarkets. And then I'll briefly touch on India, because it was probably the last place I expected to find any sort of wine culture, and also because it was part of my GFP. So the original plan, I guess, to give you a bit of perspective, it was to research alternative varieties, and especially those that are grown in warmer climates. The more I got into it, the more complex I felt it became for me, and I wouldn't be able to address it properly. But as I was trying to work it all out, it did show me that there was a lack of understanding and willingness to cooperate between the different members of the supply chain, whether it be between farmers and winemakers, or the winemakers and consumers. So I felt that I'd have a crack at trying to condense that and just make it a little bit easier, particularly for farmers to understand how the whole process works, so we're not just looking at a price all the time and basing our judgments on that. So you're finding out that farmers just don't have to grow grapes; they can grow their own wine too, and that's been quite a market take up in that type of model, particularly in the Lodi Valley through California, where famous for Zinfandel wine, the gnarly sort of wine, the vines that you see. Guys have moved away from a bulk production ethos to more doing it themselves, not necessarily making the wine themselves, but contracting that out and marketing themselves. And then obviously wineries, wineries can own farms too, and most of them do. Most of them want a place, if they've got a cellar door, that someone can actually go and physically see what a vineyard looks like. So that's probably a no-brainer. Distributors, I think they've probably got the best position out of anyone in the supply chain, and they're in probably the best position as well to affect the trends and influence demand. And they also own wineries, and they certainly own their own wine labels, which is quite interesting, I think. So moving on. So the actual wine tour itself. So I'll start it off in France. We didn't start in France, but I think that's the best one to kick this off with. I don't know whether I'd survive farming in that environment, to be brutal. And I don't know how many of us in here, if they were completely honest, would survive farming there, being Australian farmers. They're incredibly controlled, incredibly restricted with what they can do. There's no irrigation, so from my background, even though they have the ability to do it, it's a no-no. You're only allowed to do it once you're establishing the vines, and then that's it. There's limited herbicide, fungicide, pesticide applications. only allowed to plant specific varieties according to which appellation that you're in. You can plant other varieties. You can actually do what you want within reason, but there are significant penalties if you're planting other varieties, because they won't be able to market it under, say, like the Bordeaux or the Saint-Emilion appellation or anything like that. So, for an example, a small appellation in Bordeaux was Saint-Emilion, and there were 6 varieties that you were only allowed to plant if you wanted to call your wine a Bordeaux wine. The predominant ones being Cab Sauv, Cab Franc, Merlot, and also Malbec. They employed a lot of, as growers, they employed a lot of best practices, almost to the point of becoming organic, but not quite there. They spent a lot of time speaking about the virtues of their what they call terroir. So basically, saying they grow the same variety of grapes on different types of soils, whether it's sandy, gravel, clay, and then that same variety on those different types actually produces probably 3 distinct types of wine, which I didn't quite buy into it, but the more I spoke to them, the more you believed it, and then obviously there is some merit in what they're doing there. On the whole, it was quite an involved process, right from the cultivation of the grapes through to the making. One of the vineyards I visited, the average age of the vine was 45 years old. Their youngest was 4 years old. Their oldest, I think, was 97 years old. So obviously, compared to at home, they're much, or we're much younger. So the whole process quite involved. The only room for distinction as farmers is your timing of things, and I think that's true across probably all businesses and definitely all farming operations. And the amount of care, I think, taken with the fruit was probably one of the biggest distinctions between how we grow grapes in our area at home and how the French do it. They just seem to care, and they do care a hell of a lot more than what we do. And all I could think of was contrasting at home when they were explaining to me that everything's hand-picked and then it goes onto a table and it gets sorted by 30 different people who pluck berries and discard some and get rid of the stems. All I could think of, we're delivering, grapes at home in road trains. Like, this is just, very time-consuming. So completely different, but Bordeaux really showed that there's a superior amount of care taken. The region wants to protect its reputation, which I guess is why it's so controlled. With such strict laws, and there's a concerted effort to be chemical-free, not quite organic, but chemical-free. And my thought on that was, what's the point of being almost organic if you can't get all the way there? And as it was explained to me, I think in Australia and probably amongst the New World areas, we see organic as from a marketing point of view, like it's almost an organic brand, and people want to buy organic because it's organic, not necessarily because it's, pesticide-free, residue-free, all that sort of thing. Whereas in France, it's very much the opposite mindset. It's not a marketing tool. It's like they genuinely want to buy, stuff that doesn't have any pesticides on it, things like that. So I thought that was just my opinion, my takeaway from it. But I thought that was quite interesting. And then moving on to Spain, I'll talk about Spain because that's probably the best example, one of the better examples I could find. There's a famous variety out of there called Tempranillo, or Tempranillo as we call it here in Australia. Although it's considered alternative in Australia at the moment, it's probably on the back end of that trend. But nevertheless, it is quite popular, and so I thought it was worthwhile. So it's grown in a warmer region in Spain, in the middle to the north in Roesia, where it's suited well. Higher climate, it's a very short season variety, and I think Australian consumers feel as though they have a place with it because of that. It's seen as an alternative to mainstream varietals like your Shiraz and Carbonats and things like that. And as a consumer, I guess, as a discerning wine consumer, they're always looking for the next best thing. So someone who will consciously, buy an alternative variety does so because of the perception. It's new, it's different, different aromas, different flavours, textures and styles and things like that. And marketers increasingly have methods for alternative varieties that are highlighting such things as, putting it into a niche market and honing in on why it's environmentally friendly to have this particular variety and things like that. And that it's undiscovered and it's something special about it. Something that did come across in conversation when I was in Spain and I didn't think of when I was looking at marketing and the alternative varieties was that it's really no longer about having an alternative variety. There's a lot of it that comes into the fact that they want like a very different origin of that, like an alternative origin to where that grape is grown. So you're seeing, you're seeing on wine lists, Peruvian wine, and I didn't get to taste it, so I can't tell you if it was good or not. But the attraction there, I guess I'm getting to, is that they've got a wine from a very different origin, and that's exacerbated by the fact that it's got an alternative variety in that. So that becomes the attraction. So it was not only about the contents of the bottle, but a lot about where it was actually from, the type of grape it was, and then that whole story behind it. So, and then on to California. Now, I'm not sure, this is probably a little bit off topic, but I think it's worthwhile mentioning. I'm not sure how many of you have been to California or how many of the new scholars are thinking about going to California, but I think purely not from a grape point of view, but an agricultural point of view, a lot of things happen in California, and if they haven't happened there, they're about to happen there, or they are happening, and if they have happened there and they're not there anymore, it's for a very good reason. And I don't say that jokingly. I say that because it is so diverse. It's such a diverse region. They're on the cutting edge. Like you can drive, for 2 or 3 hours, and you'll go from rice fields, almonds, grapes, cotton, and everything is in sync. And it's amazing to think that so many different enterprises can exist with competing resources, and the place somehow still functions. Obviously, they've got some issues, but particularly being with water. But I just think it's a very good. There's a lot of industries in California, and I'd be most surprised if you were studying a topic and they didn't have some sort of relationship to California in that. So, moving on. Anyway, so lucky to get a last-minute visit to here. Actually, University of California at Davis, and particularly the Mondavi Institute. We're lucky to meet with an Australian professor there, Robert Boulton, and he was fantastic. It's the sort of guy you walk away from just with your head exploded, thinking, how am I going to synthesise all this? But anyway, he was really about sustainable wineries, environments, biodiverse things, right from the ground up through to the consumer. They've actually built this environmentally sustainable winery, which is there. It's probably not a great picture. The Jess S. Jackson, which is pretty much self-contained itself. And it really got us thinking about, what it was to work in our environment to make it, like that, I guess. He also was quite adamant about focusing what your particular region is best at doing, or what you're best at doing, and choosing one and sticking to it. Not being a jack of all trades and being mediocre at everything, but just choosing 1 or 2 things and making sure you're the best at it. And that was highlighted through the argument, whether you're from a bulk producing region for grapes or a niche producing region, which way do you do? Which way do you go? And so we had an interesting debate. It's obviously more expensive to produce a niche wine variety, or the rest, a sustainable one that's biodiverse, one that's organic, which means that you're producing something that's more expensive, so you automatically eliminate a lot of your market. So you go into those top 5%, I guess, of people that can afford to buy such a wine. So in a country like, in a European country, say something like Italy, France, Germany, wherever you are, it's easy to do that because your top 5% is quite a big pool to market to. Like in California, you've got 25 million people in California, top 5% there is the same as in Australia, but you've got the rest of the US on your doorstep. So it's very easy, I think, from that perspective to say, well, I can target a top 5% because I know with all the grapes that I grow, I know I've got a pretty good chance of capturing that pool. Not so in Australia, because that top 5% in Australia is just a smaller pool. So it gets to the stage where, and other industries have seen it, and it happens in the wine industry now because it's all predominantly export. So then there's that inherent need to be able to export. And as soon as you start exporting something, if there's any of you who've ever been involved in export, it's just a completely different ball game, right? From the costing, the funding, the skill sets, and everything. So then it led me to the conundrum. It's like, if you focus on producing, do we focus on producing bulk, which is a less branded grape, or do we try and differentiate ourselves and stand apart, produce smaller quantities, and only for high-end consumers? A big part of me says, You've got to differentiate. A big part of me says you've got to stand alone, and we've all heard it from talks today that marketing, getting to the consumer, it's very important to close that gap. Now, as much as I would like to do that, it obviously costs a lot of money to do things like that, a lot of money out of cash flow to do it, and then you get to the point where margins are quite tight, and you think, well, am I actually good at producing niche things, niche grapes or whatever it is, or are we better at producing bulk where we are? So that was I guess that was an interesting argument that I was having in my head, and with the travel companion I was with, just trying to nut it all out, like, where to from here? Do we stick to what we're good at, or do we venture out and try and do something a little bit different? Anyway, moving on to the UK, and this is all about, for me, about distribution. That's a photo of Berry Brothers and Rudd, which is a famous wine distributor in the UK for the royal family and other, should I say, hobnobs. So I wanted to talk about the UK predominantly because the distribution system is most similar to Australia, purely for the fact that it's dominated by supermarkets. And I walked away from a couple of meetings there thinking, when I grow up, I want to own a supermarket and distribute alcohol, because the margins in that are just phenomenal, like 25%. Now, 25% is great, and I will say though, out of that 25%, you've got to pay taxes and duties and things like that. I just thought that such a markup was great. The lowest they got to was 5%. And I was just scratching my head thinking, why am I farming, taking on all this debt and not getting the 25% with the least amount of risk, I think, in the supply chain. But anyway, I was quite interested to hear that the wine's actually built to a price, rather than Australian wine over there I'm talking is actually built to a price, rather than there being a price discovery at the consumer level. So the major supermarkets will say, basically, build me a £5 bottle of wine, and then they'll come over to Australia and they'll tender that out, and they'll say, right, I need to know what a £5 bottle of wine tastes like, looks like, smells like, and whoever's got the best price, I guess, wins. And then that gets shipped over to the UK major warehouses in bulk, in big bulk 25,000 litre container bladders, and it just gets probably the same wine gets a different label put on it to go to different areas within the UK, different supermarkets within the UK, and even to continental Europe as well. What I found most striking about that was the level of collaboration between the supermarket and the Australian winemaker. For some reason, I just didn't think that they were that close together. I fully expected, probably naively now, to think that whether we're producing a bulk stock standard wine or a 15-pound bottle of wine or whatever it is, whatever type, like for all ranges, I just expected that we would produce that, our wineries would send it overseas if it was for export, and it would go to a merchant there and then it'd get marketed from there. But it works in the complete opposite way, and I don't necessarily think it's dominated by consumers. I think it's more dominated by the supermarket just almost telling consumers, like, this is what you're going to drink because it's £5 and that's where we can buy it from. So the consumers, although it should come down from here, and I guess to an extent it does, I just found that it was predominantly driven by those big supermarket distributors. I'll just briefly touch on the next slide, which is about India. And as I mentioned before, it was the last place I expected to see any sort of wine culture. And this is Mr. Subhash, and he's the president of the Delhi Wine Club. And I thought it was a good example because we actually had that was at the Australian consulate, I think, so we had a good day there, and it was interesting talking to him because it was an example of the uphill battle that some merchants face to improve the image of wine. So being in France, where wine has a very great image, and you go to a place like India where they've got to actually justify how how they want to improve that image and how good it actually is, because there's an environment there, as explained, with I guess a stigma of alcohol. He was adamant about building the reputation for wine, and particularly as a substitute for whiskey, because people, as he said, people tend to drink cheap whiskey, and it's hard to once you go from drinking cheap whiskey to enjoying a nice bottle of wine. Anyway, so, geez, I'm a bit long here. I might speed up, boys. Sorry. Outcomes, recommendations. basically the outcome of this whole trip just drove me to drink, because I couldn't quite settle on how to how just to get everything out of my head and spit it out on paper. But I'll give it a go. First and foremost, as corny, as cliched, and as silly as it sounds, there needs to be more collaborations. Everyone needs to communicate more. There needs to be more involvement and alignment with other people along the supply chain. And that's probably not something that's new. It's just probably something that we talk about and don't do as farmers. So instead of just selling your products and forgetting about it, like I'm happy with that price and just walk away, there should be a little bit more time invested beyond that. You know, why are we getting that price, and what did you actually end up doing with it? And being able to make yourself available at different discussions. Achievements to talk about, I mean, I don't know. I literally just got back before this week, so it'd be too early to tell what I've achieved from this. But at its most base level, I just hope that, particularly a farmer, once the report's finished, that can sort of pick that up and have some sort of sense of understanding about how the industry works and what's involved. And just briefly, the next step for us at home as a family, and then the industry. Next step for us at home, we're actually, as bad as it sounds, we're actually pulling some grapes out at the moment, not to plant anything else, but to put more in. So as we speak, we've got I think an excavator with a claw plucking out vines in the view to plant more. We've got about 200 hectares. So if we do 20 hectares a year, that's 10 years. So, we're looking at I guess, between a 10 and 15 year timeline. And we hope we've got enough grapes now for critical mass. And I guess we can put that on the boiler for the time being and focus on other things that are becoming more lucrative as they are. But we've still got that solid base that if we can expand, we've got the land to do it, and we're ready to go. And for the industry, I think just more conscious about the whole chain, and be specifically conscious about how we in Australia probably lack the understanding. We're not that environmentally savvy. We talk about it, but we don't really do anything about it compared to the rest of the world. And it really, perception is reality, and the rest of the world is gearing towards an element of sustainability and best practices. And I think we need to really probably pull our finger out and get better at that. Storytelling. Now, I'm not sure if I've spoken to many people here, but I myself, as a consumer, I don't go much on stories, because I've seen what goes into a bottle of wine from the ground, and then you read the back of the label, and you just think that can't be true. So I don't buy into it. The rolling hills and the limestone scattered throughout. I just don't buy into it. So I'm coming from a very, I guess, a rare background in that. But yeah. But story, very important to come close. And as a grower, I realise that. As a consumer, I don't, because I am a grower. So, but I do. You really have to close that gap. And the other thing is to take more control over anything that you can control yourself. You should, because if you can do it, then you should be able to do it better than the other person that's supposed to be part of that. And just focus on being the best at something, and not necessarily the biggest. And that's about it, I think. A couple of things for discussion, but I probably should get off now. I'm done half an hour.